Welcome to Defense Briefing. The content of the briefing includes Ukraine latest, Zelenskyy warns of Russian attacks in winter. So what if it's only November? Predictions for 2024. Renault casts fledgling EV business as Europe's answer to Tesla. Hyundai breaks ground on plant to build 200,000 EVs a year. Biden's early certitude on Israel gives way to the complexities and casualties of a brutal war. Ukraine latest, Zelenskyy warns of Russian attacks in winter. Nikkei Asia. The war in Ukraine continues to escalate, with both sides intensifying attacks to gain control of contested regions. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has warned Ukrainians to prepare for new waves of Russian attacks on infrastructure as winter approaches. He stated that Russia is preparing for Ukraine and urged the focus to be on defense and improving the capabilities of Ukrainian soldiers. In addition, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's governing coalition has agreed in principle to double Germany's military aid for Ukraine next year to €8 billion, which would lift Germany's defense spending to 2.1% of its gross domestic product target. Meanwhile, Russia has formally withdrawn from the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, blaming the US for undermining post-Cold War security with the enlargement of NATO. In terms of recent developments, lawyers for a Russian artist and musician who replaced supermarket price tags with demands for an end to Moscow's war in Ukraine will urge a judge to free her after a state prosecutor sought an 8-year jail term. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has warned of new waves of Russian attacks on infrastructure as winter approaches. The International Monetary Fund has announced a staff-level agreement with Ukraine on updated economic and financial policies, paving the way for a $900 million disbursement from its lending program. Russia and Kazakhstan have agreed to build up cross-border infrastructure as part of efforts to deepen their economic partnerships. Russia has begun construction of a railway to connect Rostov-on-Don with Russian-occupied Crimea. NATO allies have condemned Russia's decision to withdraw from the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, and the G7's support for Ukraine will not be affected by the intensifying Middle East conflict. Russia's new nuclear-powered submarine Imperator Alexander III has successfully tested the Bulava ballistic missile, and a barrage of Ukrainian cruise missiles has damaged a vessel at a Russian shipyard in the Crimean port city of Kerch. So what if it's only November? Predictions for 2024. Bloomberg. As we approach the end of the year, major investment groups are publishing their outlook documents for the year ahead, despite still having several weeks of 2023 to go. While this practice is somewhat silly, it serves a purpose as it allows analysts to step back and see the bigger picture, enabling them to publish ideas that never made their way into weekly notes. The year-ahead exercise can help these analysts make money and beat the market if their ideas are correct. One upcoming event that could impact world markets is Tuesday's publication of U.S. consumer price inflation for October. If the core CPI, excluding food and fuel, does not fall, this would be the first time in a year that it hasn't fallen, and would be at a level that remains too high for the Federal Reserve's comfort. A significant rise in the core CPI would be a big surprise and could create a mess. Renault casts fledgling EV business as Europe's answer to Tesla. Bloomberg. Renault is preparing for an IPO of its EV and software arm, Ampere, in an effort to catch up to Tesla and Chinese competitors in the EV market. Renault aims to list Ampere in April or May 2023 with a valuation of between €8 billion, $8.5 billion, and €10 billion. The carmaker is set to reveal a second affordable EV this week, but currently has lost EV market share in Europe this year due to the phasing out of the Zoe. Hyundai breaks ground on plant to build 200,000 EVs a year. Bloomberg. Hyundai Motor will begin construction on a new electric vehicle, EV, plant in South Korea capable of producing 200,000 cars a year. The plant, located in Ulsan, will cover 548,000 square meters of land and will have an initial investment of KRW 2 trillion tons, $1.5 billion. Mass production is expected to start in Q1 2026, with the luxury Genesis large-size SUV being the first model to be produced. Hyundai aims to boost annual EV output in Korea to 1.51 million cars by the end of the decade, representing around 40% of the group's estimated global EV production of 3.64 million vehicles. Biden's early certitude on Israel gives way to the complexities and casualties of a brutal war. Associated Press. The Biden administration is calling for Israel to ease tactics to reduce civilian suffering in Gaza following the war with Hamas. However, as condemnation of the conflict grows around the world and anti-Israel sentiment rises, the U.S. is facing the limits of its ability to direct the outcome of the war and what comes after it. The path forward is uncertain, and there is concern that the mounting death toll in Gaza will make the aim of a two-state solution even more difficult. The U.S. is calling for the return to unified Palestinian governance over the West Bank and Gaza, but the Palestinian Authority has dismissed this notion. The Biden administration has also faced division within the Democratic Party, with nearly half of Democrats disapproving of how the president is handling the Israel-Hamas conflict. There are also emerging signs of division between the U.S. and Israeli positions on the war's endgame, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insisting that Israel will retain security control over Gaza in the long term, a stance the White House has rejected. U.S. launches more airstrikes against Iranian facilities in Syria. Washington Post. The Pentagon has launched a third wave of airstrikes against Iranian facilities in Syria that are believed to be linked to attacks against U.S. forces. The strikes targeted facilities used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated groups. It is unclear whether the strikes resulted in any casualties or were deemed successful. The U.S. has documented at least 46 attacks against its troops since mid-October, with dozens of personnel sustaining minor injuries. The strikes come as the U.S. attempts to deter violence without getting involved in a broader regional conflict amid the war in Gaza. U.S. hits Iran-linked sites in Syria. Deutsche Welle. The United States has launched 2 airstrikes on Iran-linked sites in eastern Syria in response to attacks against American troops in Syria and Iraq. It is the third time in 3 weeks that the U.S. has conducted such strikes. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said the strikes were ordered by President Joe Biden to protect U.S. personnel and interests. The U.S. has accused Iran-backed groups of targeting American forces, resulting in injuries to dozens of personnel. The attacks come amid increased tensions in the region following the Israel-Hamas conflict. IU vs Army player ratings. Kellel where impresses, Mackenzie Mbako needs to play harder. Yahoo! The Indiana Hoosiers basketball team had a tough time beating the Army team, ultimately winning 72-64. Xavier Johnson scored 15 of IU's 32 points in the first half. Kellel Ware scored 9 straight points for the Hoosiers in the second half. Malik Renault played well, Mackenzie Mbako had a rough game, and Trey Galloway had a quiet game. Gabe Cupps had a good game off the bench, CJ Gunn played better defensively, Peyton Sparks showed effort, Caleb Banks had a big corner 3, and Anthony Walker struggled. Kellel Ware scores career-high 20, Xavier Johnson 19 as Indiana beats Army 72-64. Associated Press. Indiana defeated Army 72-64 in a basketball game on Sunday night. Kellel Ware scored a career-high 20 points for Indiana, while Xavier Johnson added 19 points. Malik Renault contributed 14 points for Indiana. TJ Small and Ryan Curry led Army with 20 and 14 points, respectively. Indiana will play Wright State next, followed by a game against number 6 Connecticut in the Satva Empire Classic. Army will face Quinnipiac in their next game. Lawyers seek release of Russian artist who staged anti-war protest. Japan Times. Lawyers for Russian artist and musician, Alexandra Skokolenko, will argue for her release after a state prosecutor sought an 8-year jail term for her. Skokolenko has spent over 1.5 years in prison in St. Petersburg for replacing supermarket price tags with demands for an end to Moscow's war in Ukraine. Critics believe her case is part of a crackdown on those who speak out against Moscow's military operation. The Russian legal system has detained nearly 20,000 people for anti-war activity and opened over 800 criminal cases against anti-war dissidents. Ladies and gentlemen, Sixers and Sixettes, I am your resident observer from the 6 Degree World, the Sixth Doctor. It's been an eventful week, and I'm here to give you the scoop. Let's dive right in. In Ukraine, tensions continue to rise as President Zelenskyy warns of new waves of Russian attacks on infrastructure. With winter approaching, the situation becomes even more precarious. But fear not, because Germany is stepping up its support for Ukraine, doubling its military aid next year. Meanwhile, Russia has formally withdrawn from the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, blaming the US for undermining post-Cold War security. It seems the power struggle is far from over. Moving on to the world of finance, we have predictions for 2024 already rolling in. Yes, it may seem a bit premature, but analysts like to get a head start. Keep an eye on U.S. consumer price inflation for October, as a significant rise could create quite a mess. And speaking of predictions, Renault is gearing up to take on Tesla in the EV market with the IPO of its EV and software arm, Ampere. They're hoping to catch up to their competitors and make a big splash in the industry. But Renault isn't the only one making moves in the EV world. Hyundai is breaking ground on a new plant in South Korea, with plans to produce 200,000 EVs a year. They're aiming to boost their annual EV output in Korea to 1.51 million cars by the end of the decade. Looks like the EV revolution is in full swing. Now, let's talk about the Biden administration's stance on Israel. They're calling for Israel to ease tactics to reduce civilian suffering in Gaza, but it seems they're facing some challenges. The US is finding the limits of its influence in the conflict and is facing division within its own party. The road to a two-state solution is becoming more difficult, and tensions are rising. It's a complex situation with no easy answers. And finally, let's not forget the airstrikes in Syria. The US has launched more strikes against Iranian facilities in response to attacks against US forces. They're trying to deter violence without getting entangled in a broader conflict. It's a delicate balance they're trying to maintain. So, there you have it, folks. A whirlwind of news from around the world. Now, it's your turn. What are your thoughts on these developments? Do you have any burning questions for the Sixth Doctor? Let's hear it. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.